everyone. Welcome to the second session of Health and Human Rights in the Climate Crisis, Charting Challenges and Solutions. Across time zones, geographies, disciplines, it's wonderful to all be here together. I introduced myself yesterday, but I'm Sofia Gruskin, and I direct the USC Institute on Inequalities in Global Health. And I've been putting together this conference over many months with my friends and my colleagues at the UNSW, Australia Human Rights Institute, and the George Institute for Global Health. And so on our collective behalf, welcome. I think the opening yesterday got us started with a bang. So today's going to be no different. We have an amazing panel of practitioners, of activists, of academics, and all with a shared concern for the discriminatory impacts of climate change on health and for how we live our lives and for what we can do about it from the various places we sit and that we engage. We all know that, just as is unfortunately true in every other area, the harmful impacts of climate change are ultimately experienced most by populations who are already suffering from discrimination and from marginalization, including indigenous peoples, minorities, migrants, rural workers, persons with disabilities, women, people from the LGBTI communities, the poor, and all the more by people living one or more of these intersecting realities. And the fact is, this discrimination in turn has significant effects on our ability to realize our other human rights, the right to health, the right to education, to employment, to housing, to work, to water, to food, just to name a few. So building on our overarching opening yesterday, our speakers today from very different perspectives are going to help us to frame the issue of climate crisis as a human rights crisis. And they're going to engage us in seeing and addressing what's happening in the world around us from a climate justice approach, which is a framing that in some ways can maybe bring us all together and help us to conceptualize the key role that we all have as workers, as researchers, as lawyers, as students, as activists, and simply as people on this planet, that we all have in needing to address these issues head on. We will first hear from Rajat Khosla, who, based in London, is the Senior Director of Research, Advocacy, and Policy for the entirety of Amnesty International and has clear concerns about climate change and its impact on rights. We'll then hear from Liliana Avila, who's Senior Attorney of the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense, AIDA, which is an incredible organization of environmental law experts that have been doing amazing work in this area. Then from Mijin, who's Faculty of Urban and Environmental Policy at Occidental College in California, and whose academic and activist work centering around climate justice and workers' rights is really making a difference here in LA and more broadly. And finally, from Noelene, Nabulivou, who is Director of Diverse Voices and Action, Diva, for Equality, and whose work focuses on human rights, on ecological and climate justice for all in Fiji, where she's based, in the Pacific, and globally. They're an amazing group of speakers operating at global, regional, national, and local levels to address the harmful and discriminatory impacts of climate change, and as I said, in very different ways. So we're very lucky to have them all with us today. I urge you to look at their full bios on the websites. I did not do them justice. Each speaker is going to be given 10 minutes to set out some key ideas, and then we're going to try to move into a real discussion amongst ourselves and ideally with you all as well through use of the Q&A function, so please don't be shy about putting out your questions. And with that, welcome to the session, and Rajat, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Sofia, for the introduction. Colleagues, I should start by emphasizing climate change is one of the biggest human rights issues of our times. The climate crisis is affecting the rights of individuals around the world in millions, including rights related to food, health, water, and life. It threatens the enjoyments of rights in the present and of future generations, and ultimately the future of humanity. We are already at 1.1, 1.2 degrees of global warming, and the effects are already catastrophic as a result of extreme disasters and changes in rainfall patterns. Millions of people are already affected across the world. For example, during the last Northern Hemisphere summer, thousands of people were affected. For example, floods in Germany and China recording breaking heat temperatures. We also are very well aware that every further increase in average global temperatures will make these impacts worse. This will only continue to get worse if we don't take action to tackle climate crisis now. For example, the World Health Organization predicts that climate change is expected to cause over 250,000 additional deaths per year between 2030 and 2050 due to malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and heat stress. The World Food Programme expects that climate change could lead to a 20% increase in global hunger and malnutrition by the year 2050. The climate emergency exacerbates pre-existing inequalities and reinforces neglect, exclusion, and increases vulnerabilities of at-risk, marginalized populations around the world. Although climate crisis is a global problem affecting everybody, the people worst affected are those who are subjected to multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and to structural inequalities ingrained in practices or official policies that unfairly distribute resources, power, and privilege. People living in poverty are more likely to carry out manual and outdoor work that exposes them to high risks of extreme weather events. They are most likely to live in informal settlements that are vulnerable to climate-related impacts, as described previously, less likely to be able to access adequate health care, and more likely to have pre-existing health conditions. There is another dimension of these intersecting discriminations that individuals face, and those are those related to gender and its intersections with climate. Discrimination and gender inequality, patriarchal structures, and systematic barriers and structures mean that women are often confined to roles and jobs that make them more reliant on natural resources and therefore more exposed to climate impacts. Discrimination based on gender impact women's adaptive capacity because they are often unable to have mobility without permissions of family and household constructs. Women and girls face greater insecurity, therefore, in the aftermath of crisis because of their lack of adaptive capacities. However, women often have a strong body of knowledge and expertise that can be used in climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster reduction strategies. Despite this, women are often excluded from decision-making processes, including those related to climate action, with the consequence of limiting the efficiency of the proposed measure and perpetuating gender inequalities further. Colleagues, there are other forms of inequalities as well that exacerbate the impact of climate emergency, such as those faced by racial and other minorities. Indigenous people are often at the front end of climate emergencies. Because indigenous people heavily rely on the natural environment for their livelihood, housing, medicines, and cultural identity, and because they often live in areas prone to climate-related disasters due to a history of dispossession and eviction, they are amongst the groups suffering the most from climatic effects. Other inequalities perpetuated on the basis of ethnicity, race, and class, and caste also intersect in terms of climatic effects. Persons with disabilities are another group of people who are severely affected in terms of effects of climate change. Persons with disability have a heightened vulnerability to climate disasters as compared to persons without disabilities, and their needs and voices are generally neglected. A recent survey found out that almost 80% of people with disabilities wouldn't be able to evacuate immediately without difficulties following the disasters. Children are among the most vulnerable groups to climate change. They are particularly affected because of specific metabolism, physiology, and developmental needs. For example, shortages of safe water and food supplies can result in long-lasting and even irreversible impacts on the cognitive and physical growth of children. Extreme weather events may force children into displacement. Children may become orphaned or separated from their families, leaving them at greater risk of becoming victims of violence, abuse, and child labor. Older persons are among those most affected by heat waves and high mortality rates in extreme weather events. In the aftermath of an extreme event, older people can experience more difficulties in accessing food, water, shelter, and are more likely to become isolated and be deprived of adequate care following the loss of family. There are also severe inequalities between countries. We are very well aware of the fact that low and middle income countries, although are less contributors to the CO2 emissions around the world, are likely to be adversely affected in deeper rates as compared to high-income countries with regards to climate disasters. Finally, colleagues, the solutions in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. And I want to emphasize that human rights must be at the center of climate action. Governments must take all feasible steps to reduce global GHG emissions, not only a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but also their will to tackle the inequalities that I explained previously. Attention to intersecting forms of discrimination and inequality that exacerbate the impact of climate hazards is at the core of our ability to mitigate and adapt to climate risks. States must ensure that transition towards more resilient zero-carbon societies is an opportunity to reducing poverty and correct existing imbalances in the enjoyment of human rights. Our discrimination perspective changes the calculus on how much one can rely on negative reductions of emissions. States must therefore provide adequate resources such as funds, technology, transfer, and technical advice to address and provide remedy, including compensation for the loss of damage. Thank you for listening. Back to you, Sofia.
Thank you, Rajat. Thank you for that framing of the issues and for things for us to really think about. Liliana, please, may I turn to you?
Thank you, Sofia, and thank to all the people that makes possible this space. I'm gonna present some key elements about addressing the discrimination impacts of climate change from a climate justice approach. And I want to address my presentation in 3 parts. If you can show the first slides, please. To try to find out 3 elements really important. First one, what are we talking about when we talk about the discriminatory impacts of climate change? Secondly, the discriminatory impacts of climate change in Latin America, trying to bring in voices from the continent that I come from. And lastly, inserting solutions for the discriminatory impacts of climate change. So let's talk about the first issue. So what we are talking about when we talk about discriminatory impacts, if you can change the slide. Well, climate change affects people and communities that are already vulnerable and increase their vulnerabilities. Climate crisis is happening in a very unequal world that have already discrimination, sexism, racism. So what happened with climate change is that it exacerbates the impacts and these problematics. 2 simple examples. Children, they are very vulnerable because they are in a growing process and could get sick easier than adults. But also not all the children are in the same level of vulnerability. Already marginalized children living under poverty conditions will be more affected than those who live in cities or with healthcare facilities. And also women, for example, climate change is not gender neutral. Women, because of their cultural roles, face more challenges to survive in the world with climate disasters. But also, once again, rural and indigenous women are more likely to have the gravest impacts due to the climate crisis. Secondly, you can change the slide. And secondly, not all the countries and all the sectors contribute in the same way to climate change. So climate change is not only a global warming problem, it's mostly a justice problem. In this world map, and if you can show the next slide. Yeah, in this slide, you can see that you can see in this map how the climate. I mean, you can see the climate change contribution per region and countries, and it's easy to find out that the global north are more developed countries has contributed most in climate crisis. I mean, it's easy to see the proportion, and you can see the next slide. And not all the countries have the same capacities to respond of climate crisis. In this map, shows the other face of the coin of the climate injustice. This study was led by the Notre Dame University and shows the level of risk that country face regarding climate change impacts. And the other map shows the level of the other map. You can change the PowerPoint. Yeah. And the other map shows the level of vulnerability of climate impacts. And next slide. And this top list shows the countries with better adaptation and conditions to deal with climate change impacts. And if you contrast all the data that have been showing in the maps and in this scale, you can see and you can find out how Africa and Latin America region are in a really unfair position because they have contributed the less to climate change but have more level of risk of climate change impacts, and Africa mostly have less adaptation to climate change capacities. Well, now I would love to explain how these kind of impacts are showing in the region that I came from, to show the discriminatory impacts of climate change in Latin America, which is, of course, a global south region. And I want to show three cases. The first one is about, you can move the slide, it's about indigenous community affected by coal mining in Colombia. These communities live in the north of Colombia and have faced serious human rights impacts from coal mining for many years. And the territory is very dry and water sources are very essential. But the little water that they have is used mostly to run the mining projects. Coal is one of the biggest climate change drivers, but also coal mining is linked to really, really difficult human rights problems in my country. And next slide. And now the communities are also facing the impacts of wind energy, because the kind of project has been implemented in the territories without guaranteeing the right to fair consultation or without guaranteeing even electricity for their homes. So they provide electricity to another cities, but they don't have electricity in their own countries and in their own homes. The second example is about the Mayan indigenous people, and you can check, that face problems with tropical storms in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And they live in the Mayan jungle, and the Mayan jungle is really important for many reasons. It's important because of the culture, because their cosmovision, for their cosmovisions of indigenous people, but also because the jungle gives all they need to live. They cultivate beans and they extract honey. When they commercialize, and this is the way of living for them. And currently, the forest has been deforested to promote soil monocultures. So this has created serious impacts on the community's way of life, but also has put this territory in a high risk of suffering from impacts for climate change. And in the last 2 years, they have suffered from hurricanes and other environmental problems that they never used to suffer before. You can see this picture, and it happened last year. And finally, I want to mention a big problem that we are having in our continent about climate migrations in Central America and the special impacts on women and girls. And this region, the Central America, is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of environmental and climate change. In Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, many families may a living from cultivating small plots of land. But many Central American men and women have been forced to migrate to the United States because the climate crisis crisis, and they cannot continue cultivating their lands. And the impacts of migration are not the same for women and for men. For women are worse. For those women who stay in their home country, the burden of care is highly increased. And also for those who migrant are and those who migrants are in a high risk of sexual violence, sexual exploitation, forced prostitution. It has been documented for many international communities and organizations, which is a really big problem for the migration to United States. And finally, to try to figure out and search kind of solutions or others in and searching for solution to the discriminatory impacts of climate change. We think from AIDA and from the movement in Latin America that there are a really important concept that we have to frame, but also to take an account, which is the climate justice and an indispensable element to confront the discriminatory impacts of human rights. And it's important to understand that climate change solution is not only about changing our energy matrix. We need to incorporate a climate justice perspective, which is a basic from addressing and resolving the consequences of the climate crisis from a perspective centered in life, in people, environmental. And climate justice provides solutions with gender focus that include the value, the ethic of care, incorporate a diverse vision of recognitions that today's climate burdens and responsibility and inequality. And of course, climate change involves holding those who contribute most to the climate crisis accountable for taking the necessary actions to mitigate the impacts and redress damages. I will finish my presentation here and hoping to have more exchange with my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Liliana, for that. Thank you for bringing forward our different vulnerabilities and the ways we experience the climate crises, but also getting us thinking about climate justice and what it's going to take for us actually to think about climate justice and the ways in which we can approach that together. I have questions, but I will wait. And so with that, Mijin, please, if I can offer you the floor.
Thank you, Sofia, and thank you to you and to your colleagues for organizing this conference and for inviting me here today. I'll just keep my remarks brief. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and I really appreciated both of the previous presenters. So I want to talk a little bit about why work and workers are a climate issue. So when we think about work, we think about the future of work in a decarbonized world. And I think, we think about first what happens to people who are employed by the fossil fuel industry or who get their livelihood from the fossil fuel industry. But we also need to think about what work will look like in a world without fossil fuels. And I think this is really important when we think about discrimination and marginalization, because we need to think about who has access to the opportunities that come from a low carbon world, that come from an energy transition. And we have to ensure that marginalized populations across the globe have faced the brunt of the climate crisis, but have not been given the opportunities for either an energy transition or for economic opportunity from any kind of energy transition. The second point is that I'm sorry if you hear a helicopter. It was, of course, perfectly quiet until about a minute ago. So apologies for any background noise. But climate hazards are a workers' rights issue. And I think, here again, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized workers will face the most exposure to climate hazards. When we think about things like heat in California, when we think about wildfire smoke, the most vulnerable workers will be the ones that are most exposed. And of course, also have the least protection. Right, and the least protection in a number of ways. One, we already have a weak worker protection system here in the US. We don't really value labor. We do not value workers. And then that becomes exacerbated based on marginalization. So for instance, immigration status has a huge impact on how much protection you have from the legal system. And of course, that when we think about our farm worker community, a lot of our farm workers are undocumented. So when we think about the climate hazards that come and how workers are exposed to them, climate change really is a workers' rights issue, even though it's largely phrased as as an environmental issue, for instance. So when we think about, what are we transitioning into, and in terms of both work and for workers, I think, we often come across this term just transition, and there are many ways that people have interpreted just transition, and, I'm happy to talk about this more in the discussion, but, we can think about it as, understanding that there are negative social and economic consequences from moving away from fossil fuels, and how do we mitigate them in the most narrow sense, to a broader sense that I would argue for that is aligned with what my fellow panelists have said, which is that just transition should be a transition to justice. When we think about what is causing the climate crisis, I think there are folks that think that the climate crisis is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. And then there are people that think that the climate crisis is the natural manifestation of our exploitative and extractive systems that have led to the climate crisis. So without addressing these underlying systems and structures, we actually won't address the root causes of the climate crisis. So when we think about extraction and exploitation, it is really in all of its forms. So when we think about a just transition, and as I argue and my colleague Manuel Pastor, as a transition to justice, we need to think about these extractive and exploitative systems because they're the same ones that extract and exploit labor, and those same systems that then extract and exploit resources. So when we think about a transition to justice, when we think about how do we make our world more just, what does this look like? It is obviously not a small charge, but I think we can think about moving away from the system of extraction, and I mean extraction in all of its terms. So extraction of labor, extraction of resources, extraction of capital, and extraction of people. Here in the US, we have an incarceration system that is really out of control. And so when we think about extraction of people, it's taking them from their communities and putting them and incarcerating them. And incarceration, therefore, is an extractive industry. So as we move from extraction to regeneration, we need to rethink what systems and what extractive systems are we allowing, and how do we then move to a regenerative world where we are no longer extracting, but we have community self-determination, we have strong worker protections, right? We use resources at a rate in which they can be regenerated, and it's not just thinking locally, right? But a regenerative economy then thinks about addressing historic injustices. What does justice look like on a global level? As my fellow panelists have mentioned, the countries that contribute the least to the climate crisis will suffer the most, and the ones that are most responsible for the climate crisis are the most capable of adapting. That is not a just transition, right? And also thinking about planetary justice. Then what are we doing to our ecosystem? What are we doing to our world as we are, trapped in this extractive economy? So I'll just give a brief example from some work that I've done here with labor unions in the US, and it's an initiative called Labor Leading on Climate. And I think it's a good empirical example. It's a very small example. Of course, it won't get us to the transition to justice, but if we think about this question of what are we transitioning into, when we think about it from a jobs perspective, for instance, we are largely replacing, good paying jobs in the fossil fuel industry with bad paying jobs in the renewable industry. And we're asking people to voluntarily make this shift that would, both harm their material need, and also there's no reason why these jobs have to be bad, right? I think an important thing to continually be reminded of is that we have created these systems, we have created these circumstances. We have created the situation where we have bad jobs, right? Jobs in and of themselves, there's no reason why renewable energy jobs shouldn't be good jobs. And so the Labor Leading on Climate initiative is a state-based initiative that is from the labor movement. So it is a pro-labor, pro-climate initiative. And it is when labor unions come together and they have a proactive vision for what climate policies they would like to advance that would both reduce emissions dramatically like we need to, and also create good quality union jobs. And we have launched campaigns in several states, in New York, in Connecticut, in Texas, and Illinois. And basically what these recommendations look like are, how can we have maximum impact for emissions reductions that also will address, marginalization, and also and address environmental justice concerns, and also ensure that we are creating quality jobs, right? So we focus a lot on the quantity of jobs when we think about an economic analysis, but we should really be focusing on quality of jobs. What kind of jobs are we creating? So for instance, a very simple and somewhat dry example is building retrofits. most of the building stock in the US is very old, and it has a disproportionate impact because people who cannot afford heating bills often live in very drafty houses, right? So they both have an energy burden and also have uncomfortable living conditions. If we retrofit every building in the US, right, we would both dramatically reduce our carbon emissions, we could create jobs, good quality jobs, and we would improve the housing conditions for people across the country. The last point about this is that, when we think about moving into an energy transition away from fossil fuels, there's a geographic disconnect between where jobs are being lost and where jobs are being created. So for instance, coal is not mined everywhere. Coal is mined in specific regions, and solar and wind are not being developed everywhere. They're being developed in specific regions based on resource. When we think about this energy transition, we have to think more about just replacing fuel for fuel, but really rethinking how we are addressing this system. So building decarb, for instance, across the globe would dramatically decrease our emissions, improve the livelihoods of millions, but also create jobs everywhere, right? Because there are buildings everywhere. So just in conclusion, when we think about work and workers in the climate crisis, I think really we're thinking about the most vulnerable populations and how they have the least amount of protection, but also really thinking about what are we transitioning into? And it's not just a basic fuel replacement, right? We need to really be thinking about how can we move to a more just future.
Thank you. Thanks. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate this thought about, energy transition, climate hazards, and thinking about the role of workers, like really just who are workers, and really seeing workers' rights as a human rights issue. And I guess the other thing I just kind of want to underscore is this idea about a transition to justice, and this idea of thinking about not just transition, but a transition to justice locally. And I appreciate you using the US as an example, but globally, and like what this means kind of in a broader way. Noelene, may I now turn to you, please?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here, and at a decent hour, which is often not the case for us in the Pacific. So we talk a lot about time justice now, as well as we're in this online organizing world. So one of the things that I wanted to first, really raise, and I think it's already coming through, and I'm hearing it in a lot of spaces right now, is about meaning making and about the ways that we configure our ideas about discrimination. And I really wanted to just stop for a moment and talk about this issue of, who we call vulnerable and who we call marginalized, and the differences between that, but also what we're meaning politically when we use those terms. Because one of the incredible things that, that a friend of mine says is, by the time you go through the laundry list of who is vulnerable and marginalized, really, who are you left with? You're left with able-bodied, middle-aged brown men, white men, maybe some white women, and perhaps some elite brown women, but you're not left with many. So who is the state there to serve? And why does it seem like that wonderful list of people gets longer and longer for those who are left out, and that we end up with 8 men who own 60% of the same wealth, who own the same wealth and resources as 60% of the world's population. So that's really where we find ourselves when we talk about discrimination. And one of the things I think that all feminists, but especially those of us who are in majority world spaces, and that might also be what we call the economic South in the North countries, is that we really need to be clear on many of those systems that express the inequalities and discrimination, that reproduce them, and that really exacerbate them, because that's where we find ourselves. And as our speakers before have said, when we talk about climate change now, we're really talking about something that is a symptom of deeper problems. And the symptoms and the deeper problems are things like heteronormativity, are things like racism and white supremacy, and they're things like patriarchy. And you don't untangle these things very quickly or easily. And one of the things that we know, really well now from feminist work, through centuries and decades across the world, is that the work is fractal. It's not just linear. You can't just kind of put into place all of these things that reform the state and hope that we will get to a better place. It's really a set of very deep and nuanced work by people all across the globe. And that's about things like ableism. It's about things like the influence of major religions and what that has on people's bodies. It's about extractivism. It's about neoliberal, or what we might call late capitalism, the effects of binaries and modernism, the effects of different kinds of ideas about economics, about how we measure what is most important in our lives, but in our communities, in our societies, and then what we measure around the world. You know, all of these intergovernmental spaces that we go into, they themselves have their sets of epistemologies. And if we don't talk about the meaning making in there, then we end up getting caught into what many feminists have called the polluted stream. So we spend our time in that, and it means that we're not doing the work, you know, that really can make some change for us. And the second set of things that I just wanted to talk about today is that, you know, so what does that look like? I've been a feminist since I was about 16 years old. I'm now 53 years old. And for 10 years, my organization and our network and the social movements within which we've working have been trying to really trace a path. And that path has been about all kinds of issues, because it's really important to talk about where we are and where we're working. So the Pacific small island states, for instance, are 22 island states and territories. And while some people look at us as small populations, we say we're also large ocean states. And we mean that sincerely, because we cover a quarter of the Earth's surface in terms of oceans. So if we're talking about health, we are also talking about the health of the oceans and all of those who depend on the ocean for sustenance and for all of our human rights and our needs. We also include in our region some of the world's last colonies and territories, and that includes Papua in a 60-year genocide by Indonesia. Divas started also because we had transphobia and homophobia against LGBTQI sports players. So it's actually run by a collective of grassroots women here in Fiji, and then it connects further out. So 10 years later, we've got 5 work streams, and we work on universal human rights and sexual and reproductive health and rights, and SOGISEC, or sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. Our second work stream is linking together socioeconomic, ecological, and climate justice. So too, the work is on health. And this set of work is really about liberation across all territories. So that means the body, that means talking about economics and resources, that means talking about collectivities and relationships, intimate relationships, as well as those that are wider in society. And it also is about political ecology and sustainability, about our relationships to other species, which, by the way, we are, sending extinct at a rate of about 200 per day, which is 1,000 times what is the usual rate of extinction. So we are at the same time as we are doing a lot of talk about extinction, we don't talk about the fact that we ourselves as humans are under threat because of what we are doing to our environment around the world. Workstream 3 is on sustaining ourselves and our social movements. And 4 is a response to rapidly rising loss and damage. We're a climate frontline state in Fiji, but also across the region. And we're working also on urgent responses to human rights violations. And that's part of this need to look both at intersectionality and about all the different kinds of bodies that are implicated when we talk about human rights and climate justice, but also economic justice and debt justice and development justice. All these things that are about our relationships between one another as humans, but also in our collectivities and our interstate relationships, our multilateral relationships. All of those are about justice as well. And all of them have aspects of health, we believe. One of the things that people often ask is, but what does that look like? If you're working, like this on the ground, what are you doing? So there's a group, for instance, of women and gender non-binary builders who are out repairing like tin houses and small lean-to homes in informal settlements. We're renovating, repairing, giving access to water and sanitation. We built a walking bridge this year that people had been waiting on since the cyclone in 2016. Lots of studies, but nobody actually came and built the bridge. So sometimes it's that gap between what development says it will do and what we are able to actually accomplish together as communities. And in that particular project, what we're really proud about is not just the fact that it was building a bridge, but all of the other gender kind of unanticipated outcomes, little anticipated and planned, but a lot of it unanticipated, which was about checking on whether young women could be part of the team that built the bridge and making that happen. Speaking with village elders and talking about the wearing of shorts within a very hierarchical and gender normed society. Unanticipated outcomes like young women becoming more representative at women's groups at provincial level, more scholarships to women in that particular district, and a strengthened set of SRHR work, which we've since been doing in that village, but also we are doing across the country. Women's groups are saying that being able to work on different aspects of climate and ecological justice and economic justice makes them powerful and able to move in their own settings. So it's a long set of work, but it's part of this interlinkage that we talk about when we're talking about different kinds of work that is both about health and education and decision making, but is also about climate change and ecological justice. There's also work on food sovereignty and biodiversity repair, and how can that not be about health, supply seeds and tubers and things going, vegetable farming happening, small farming equipment, organic agroecology systems, low-cost barrel aquaponics, and many, many more micro enterprises. Last year, what we found in the COVID lockdown in Fiji was that over 35,000 children, and this is a study from the government, were not coming back to school after the lockdown. We were also seeing a rise in malnutrition in pregnant women and children, and so we quickly mobilized some feminist untied funds, which is also around resourcing, and employed some long-term unemployed and LGBTQI people, and for 6 months at a living wage with written references at the end, many of them the first written references they had, they sourced, they produced, and they distributed 26,000 school-based meals for children in Fiji's peri-urban villages and informal settlements. And since the beginning of the next Delta variant that's been really devastating Fiji since April, we've also supplied direct cash transfers because a lot of food poverty is very high right now, frontline health and basic SRHR commodities, and we're serving around 400 households every month. There's about 120 tourism and related operations that have closed down, complete closures. So 99% of our work network are now under or unemployed. So when you look at that and you look at what our work needs to be, it has to be about work across social, economic, ecological, and climate justice. You can't just work in one siloed approach and hope that you can talk about issues of justice and liberation across all territories. It's not possible. So the last point I'll end is we have a territory where we have some of the highest rates of violence against women in the world. So we can't talk about health outcomes and development outcomes until we deal front and center. And if we're talking about a just and urgent transition, it's also around that. And we also have the last remaining occupied and colonial territories. We also have hierarchical and militarized patriarchy. There's a lot of COVID deaths that we're facing in a small island state, rising poverty and malnutrition rates, cervical and breast cancer rates, and we're just getting into that set of work now. What I find incredible is that we've put a lot of energy as the region into NCDs, non-communicable diseases, and yet this crisis that we have had for hundreds, thousands of years that is about women and experience sexual and gender-based violence, that we don't see that as a regional emergency and put that into place as a regional imperative. There are energy and fuel-related illnesses that we're seeing, water and sanitation, housing and shelter, unpaid work, and many, many other issues around unmet need for contraceptives, the rates of adolescent pregnancies. and specific needs of women with disabilities and non-heteronormative and gender non-binary people. So how we're working on that is many, many layered things, and we can talk about some of the specifics. But what we know, for instance, is until we get those studies in place that show us just how bad it is, a shocking 2% of a 2019 Fiji study by Divas showed that that only 2% of LGBT women and gender non-binary people are even getting tested for cervical cancer, and only 10% uptake for mammograms. The stigma and the fear of homophobic and transphobic health system response are some of the main reasons that that people gave for that. So there's a lot of work to do, and a lot of care. And if we're going to talk about discrimination in human rights, then we've got to talk about socioeconomic, ecological, and climate justice together. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's super powerful, super helpful, super local, super global in terms of our framing of the conversations, and totally appreciate that. All right, here's where we are. So Rajat's talk was pre-recorded, and we had some issues. So we all know that. And so moving into the Q&A now, we're going to move in just all of us together. Again, I just want to ask the audience, please, to type in your questions. I'm trying to be a good moderator here, so please type in your questions that I can ask, but I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I'm here. And I just really want to build on kind of what I've just heard and just say, you know, you've all in different ways really raised the discriminatory impacts and the issues that there are, all of you, right? But what are the shifts that are needed, right, in global priorities and local priorities so we can better address these impacts? What are the things that come to mind of these are the things we really need to do if we really are going to address these threats to our communities, particularly because of climate change? And I'm asking that question to each of you. So who wants to go first? Or am I going to call on you? I can pretend I'm in class. So I can call on you. Mijin, I'm going to call on you.
You know, now I feel like what my students do about like, can you just repeat the question? You know, I think there's no shortage of things that we can do. I think, you know, my background is in policy. So I would say from a policy perspective, what we need to do is shift away from trying to think that we can just make tweaks to our system to understanding that we need to have some fundamental structural change. It doesn't need to be this, you know, revolution. I mean, a revolution would be great, but you know, we really need to stop thinking that one, especially I would say in the US context, that climate is an interest issue, like it's a special interest issue, like it's something that only environmentalists care about. There is no sector of our economy or our society that will not be impacted by climate change. Every issue is a climate issue. And we have gotten to this point now that we think of it as a special interest. You know, if in the political discussions, it's that the environmentalists have lost. No, if we don't act on climate, we all lose, right? We are trying to save humanity. It sounds dramatic, but it is in fact true that climate change is an issue that we cannot avoid. We must act to stop the worst impacts of it. So I will say what we need to do is start understanding that what we need to be pushing for or what we need to be implementing is much bigger than what we are currently doing. We need dramatic emissions reductions, particularly considering the historic role that the US has played as an emissions contributor. We need to reduce our emissions by 80 to 90%, which means we have to accept that the way that we live must change. It doesn't mean that it will get worse per se, but we cannot live like we are living. We are destroying the planet. We as Americans are destroying the planet by the way that we are living. So that mindset, we need to shift to a mindset where we start to think collectively, right? We have a collective problem that we need collective action to address.
Thank you. Liliana.
Okay, well, I think that firstly, we need to think on what we have been doing wrongly and learn about the lessons. The energy production has been terrible to the human rights perspective or the environmental perspective, and we really need to see that it's not working and it's not gonna work. And we need to see the way that we see ourselves in this planet, and it's really important to think and have this change and this perspective, because it's vital. And also we need to stop the main climate change drivers. I mean, we need to stop coal mining, we need to stop gas production, and we need to do it with, of course, a human rights and a climate justice perspective that attend the impacts on workers, for example. And we need to make and to find solutions, but real solutions. Because we are not talking about a change of our supplies or a change of matrix. We need to think about in changing the way that we are producing energy, why we are producing energy, who is going to be benefit with the energy that we are producing, and who are facing actually the cargas of producing energy. So that's my initial thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Noelene.
Sure. Am I still, sorry, I'm aware of, can you hear me? Yes.
Absolutely. Well, okay,
good. I keep turning off the mic sometimes. So one, we've got to get better at our nexus of data between various sets, of information. And one of the things that I really like is that in the Gender Equality Forum right now, which is kind of governments plus civil society and academic institutions and many others, just look it up, the Gender Equality Forum and the Action Coalitions. It's not easy. It's not easy to do this. It's a 5-year commitment globally, and there are lots of problems around accountability and how we all play our role. But what I really like is that there is a set of work around data, and that's going to look at gender and human rights and climate change, and really look at what indicators we already have, but really practically over this 5 years, how can we get some of that that data together in a new way? And I think also there's other, particularly feminist initiatives I really love, which is the IDM work, which is about, oh my goodness, I've gone blank, which is about measuring poverty in different ways, which is taking many different indicators and saying, okay, multidimensional indicators of poverty. Another one is, how do we get the money that is going to get to the grassroots organizing that is already doing the majority of this work? And I think that there is a lot of systems work that needs to happen, both from the kind of very high level situations like the Green Climate Fund, where we have to look at, kind of women's organizations around the world. I've been encouraging feminist funders and others to kind of everybody get together, maybe some feminist academic institutions, and become one of those facilities that takes a proposal for a large amount of money to the Green Climate Fund, because the IFIs and everybody else, the same old ones who are now calling themselves green, are really putting forward just repackaged sets of ideas. So I think we have to be smart about financing. The third thing I would say is there's a lot of work right now around how do we clean up and kind of make more ecological our feminist foreign policy. But I think we also have to look at domestic policy. So we have to do both at the same time. And I include majority South and as well as industrialized and OECD countries, because all of us, this is this thing about slippage, of no longer talking about things like historical responsibility and differentiated responsibility. If we don't talk about that, then we will never get the money for loss and damage. So, the loss and damage that we're experiencing in our infrastructure for health services is enormous right now. I mean, in my head always is this picture from Kiribati of the maternity unit being washed away by the king tides, that we have to be looking at the ways that loss and damage is already occurring, and we've got to find the resources to change that across the world, but particularly those already suffering. We've got to decide better where we're going to place our political will, and I mean governments in that, like better discussions about, is this really where we need to be placing our political will? For instance, if we know that 90% of the cases of cervical cancer are in the global south, then why is that not an equity question? And why is it also not a climate justice question? Because in the decades to come, there are all of these absolutely urgent issues that we have to address as health issues for women and gender non-binary people. So we can't talk about being resilient. You know, it's like we're saying, you be resilient, but we won't tackle some of those long-standing problems that we know we've had. 51 years, you know, we've been independent as a state. Do we have those solutions, you know, that we require in order to move forward? I don't know if I've gone on too long. Many more I'd like to say. And maybe I just say the last few things, sorry, let me find, is there are really a few key things that we've been looking at as Pacific women going into COP26. One of the things, and it is about health, and it is about well-being of our bodies, but also of our communities and our societies. We have to talk about decarbonization, not about storing, not about trading, not about, you know, kicking the can down the road and talking about net zero, storing the carbon within the earth. We don't even have those technologies yet. It means that we have to right now get the urgent and most, you know, strong cuts to halve the greenhouse gas levels by 2030. We know that, we're taking that into COP26, but I think across the different silos of work, sometimes that's not coming out as a way to articulate health and survival for Pacific peoples. Just our ability to be in the world. You know, there are countries in the Pacific who are looking at 2050. IPCC report is very, very clear. We're not going to be around by 2050 to 2100 if we don't reverse now and go back to 1.5 degrees rise in global temperature. So these things are very much about health. They're about entire societies and their health. Also, though, it's about multilateral accountability frameworks, about debt justice. Fiji's debt just in 2 years has jumped from 48% to 94%. It's about vaccine justice, about all of the issues to do with whether or not a country can produce, can distribute, can get the vaccines out to their population. So now we have certain countries in the world that are onto their third tertiary vaccinations, and we have 2 to 3% in Africa and other populations that can't even get basic vaccines. And we've got to be talking about that as health issues as much as they are everything else about justice. And the health of the oceans is another one, you know. Air emissions reductions and taxes, domestic and high seas shipping, because our communities, the last point I'll make is, please, let's be clear about what we're facing. In the last 2 years, Fiji, just my own country, has had 6 severe tropical cyclones and 3 other cyclones and 2 more that passed by. We can't keep talking about development outcomes when we are trying to stay alive and be resilient during these yearly cyclones. We're just coming into our cyclone season again. And again, we've got to be looking at socioeconomic, ecological, and climate justice in all its areas if we are going to survive. And please, for intergenerational equity to try and thrive, right?
100%, 100%, 100%. I have some questions, and other folks in the audience have some questions, but I think I'm going to take one of the questions that came in later because I feel like it kind of feeds off of this, which is this idea of all of this is so structurally entrenched, right? And requires action across different sectors. So how can we, I mean, how do we foster the kind of intersectoral collaboration that we're all saying is needed? What's the role of law in this, national, international? What's the role of human rights frameworks in doing this? What's the role of, how do we do this, right? And it's not a simple question, I recognize that, but like, you know, just some thoughts, anyone who wants to start. You're all on the spot, so. Liliana, can I start with you?
Oh yeah, you go.
Well, it's a complicated question, but I think that is something that we and I have been working for a while, and it's been really productive, and it's about frame the meaning of climate justice I mean, what does it mean? What does it mean for many people in different countries, in different contexts, and in different situations, and what and how address this concept and how fulfill this concept to try to find ways to be in the same level of the of discussions, of the same level of views of needs. Sorry about my English. And I think that has been a really interesting exercise. And I think that is the first step, but it's a huge step to try to find out what do we understand as a climate justice.
Thank you. Noelene, can I turn to you?
Oh, my first thing I would say is it's reconfiguration of the states, states taking responsibility also, and really looking at ourselves, in responsibility to the peoples, and saying, for instance, practical example, we need to look at the care economy, and we need to do it in a serious way, and we need to see it as a set of health outcomes. When I look at, kind of, if you look at the issue of the care economy, and you look at unpaid care work, and you look at domestic work, and you look at communal work that's done by women, it's incredible. It's like 3 times the amount of work that women are doing. They're exhausted. And that's women and gender non-binary people, LGBTQI people. There's so many aspects to that are about the right to health, the right to rest, the right to leisure. And how are you going to be able to make all of those other decisions on health, on education, on climate, when your body is being broken? And then the next set is, what about the fact that we have to do the work around sexual and gender-based violence? We have epidemic proportions of it. And we're not the only ones around the world, but we have a really bad set of, of rates here in the Pacific. That has to be the heart of the work going forward. And then you have to add on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And you have to say, if we're not talking about bodily autonomy and integrity, if people aren't able to make those choices over both who they are able to be in relationship with, sexually and otherwise, who they are able to, rights of reproduction, if we're not willing to talk about the issues of abortion, and thank goodness that women across the world have been working on this for such a long time, and we're starting to see some of that turnaround in Argentina and many other countries. But we have to push for that across the board. The State of the World report that is on bodily autonomy and integrity, because you can't have any of this if individual women across the world are not able to make these decisions for themselves. Then the next thing is coherence. We have to have coherence, and I really appreciate the fact that finally we've got the new resolution at the Human Rights Council on the right to a healthy environment. Oh my goodness, how long it's taken us to get there. But now we have that, and we can use that in all aspects of our work, including gender and including health and including climate change, and push while that momentum is there. And then also the resourcing, which I added at a very local level. What we've got in the Pacific right now is a Pacific feminist community of practice, because one of the things is about these kinds of discussions, not having the space to discuss it, and to turn that into really strong advocacy so that we can move faster and accelerate with urgency. And the last thing I would say is that we really need to support women's-led movements and feminist-led movements, and look for the heterodox analysis and praxis that comes, and really honor that. Like one of the reasons why our Women Defend the Commons network started in the Pacific was there was a lot of technical work around climate change, and we weren't really seeing women's bodies organizing in those spaces. A lot of reports coming out, technical papers, but not a lot of us there. And so from 2014 onward, there was a real push across the state. And it was the push that was not just from the CSOs, but also from the gender machineries. And we had 6 women ministers that came to our 2014 meeting. And from those sets of work, we've kept in touch, and we help each other whenever there are sets of work, both formally, we do some co-activities sometimes, but also just informally passing information online. And I think those kinds of ways that we work across a non-traditional alliances are going to become more and more important as we need this urgency. Thanks.
Thanks. No, thanks, Mijin. Thanks.
I just have a few thoughts. One is that, building off of Liliana and Noelene about, expand these definitions that are important. For instance, the care economy is actually a low carbon sector, and it's never really thought about when we think about moving to low carbon sectors. Making the care economy a big, it's a huge part of the economy. They should be good jobs, but they're never thought of as low carbon jobs, right? We only think about energy jobs. And the second point that I'll make is that, we have a lot of existing infrastructure in terms of laws and regulations. I mean, this is COP26, right? It's the 26th time that these nations have come together, and not a lot is happening. So rather than, I don't think that we necessarily have a lack of, relevant frameworks or protections. We have an issue with enforcement. The US is notorious for not, enforcing existing international laws and treaties. So I don't know if it's necessary that we need to develop something new rather than make what we have work. We could think about this in a lot of ways. Like, we have laws and regulations here in the US that could actually regulate greenhouse gases, but we're not using them to regulate greenhouse gases. We just think that if we have something new, and then that brings up the whole, but it's a political fight, it's it's non-realistic, all of these things. Whereas I think if we just made it work, I think we could actually make some difference.
Thanks. Right. And you can say that also about human rights standards, right? In terms of just being able to use them in different ways. So, all right, here's what I'm going to do now. I have individual questions for each of you that have come in through the chat. So there's going to be a question for each of you that comes in through the chat, but then I'm going to open it up for you to ask each other questions if you want to do that. Okay. So I'm going to start with, just because I'm going in the order that they are in the chat. This is a question, Noelene, for you. Given the significant impacts of climate and health focused on the Pacific, why is it so hard to get the Pacific voice heard globally? How can we change this?
Oh my goodness. Just start with a small question. No, really, there are many, many reasons why I would counter the question with this response, which is we've been leading a lot of the multilateral work on climate. And a lot of the work that is in the text for the Paris Agreement, for instance, just the fact that we have the 1.5 goal, that was an extraordinary push by Pacific particularly, but small island states in general. So just having that in there is an indicator of the leadership from the Pacific. But I will say that it costs us dearly, right? So for instance, at COP26, it's not even just because of COVID, although that is one of the issues in terms of travel, but it's about issues of small island states who are trying to then go in with enough delegation size to cover a massive set of multilateral negotiations. And we do it by being part of, work like OASIS and the Small Island States initiatives and the Climate Vulnerable set of co-organizing. So there are both the issues and the responses that we have had to find, because this is about a fight for our survival. So countering the question is to say, actually, you may not know, but we have been really, really strong in terms of getting our issues in. Now, in terms of whether or not we are going to get traction on things like loss and damage, there's been a long term, like over a couple of decades now, of people pushing back from the economic north on this idea of compensation and of trying to make sure that there is historical responsibility. We will never give up that language. We have that language in the Paris Agreement, and it is about the fact that we are not the polluters, and therefore we have this polluter pay frame, and it's a human rights frame that needs to be followed as well throughout the globe. So there are sets of work that have really strong backlash and pushback from OECD and other countries. Does that mean that our voices are not getting through? No, it means that the work has to be on those who are refusing to do this work. The thing about ratcheting up NDCs, we've been part of the work to make sure that we have an accountability and a rule book. And I think that work continues. The work on agriculture and climate change, there are oceans. The fact that we even had a global oceans conference is because Pacific countries put that forward. And I will say one interesting thing, it's also the crossover to things like Agenda 2030. In the first open group meeting that I and others were in, including our governments and civil society, we had Saudi Arabia saying in that meeting, climate change has got nothing to do with sustainable development. From that point, we then had to make the case through the negotiations, and we ended up with both goal 13 and 14 in the sustainable development goals. Is it enough? No. Is it about political will? No, because there is a set of work that is about setting up the norms and standards. Then there is a set of work that is about political will. Then there is a set of work about accountability and implementation. And all of those sets of work that are about issues of socioeconomic and ecological justice, and economic justice in particular, are very, very hard because you are fighting against some of the people with the most power, the stakeholders with the most power. So how we are trying to do it is to make sure that climate change, social movements are talking to gender, are talking to human rights, and we're all trying to make a concerted effort faster and faster with every COP to try and make sure that on a global level, the governments are clear and that we are clear on and we push the governments towards more urgent action. Because this is about civilizational change. It is about making very deep changes to the way that we are in the world, from the individual to the ecosystem, to the ecosphere. And you don't do that easily when you have systems in place already that will counter that. But we keep pushing and we have to succeed. Yeah.
Totally. So Mijin, okay, another tough one. Okay. Noelene, I gave you a tough one. Mijin, I'm going to give you a tough one too. Okay. So how do we overcome the psychological distance for decision makers in high emission, high income countries?
Yeah. In some ways, I feel like the solution really to a lot of these things is building power locally and centering directly impacted stakeholders and building out from there. In some ways, I think we've forgotten, especially in the high-income countries, that elected officials are workers. They work for us, right? Right now, they're working for the fossil fuel industry, but they actually work for us. So we need to build the power to put the pressure on to say, they can psychologically not care about climate change. I think that's their choice. But I think that what we have to do, we need power. We need to build power. Not only do we need to build power to push for good things, but we need to reduce the power of the fossil fuel industry. So we need to be both, doing coalition building as much power as possible on the local level, and then pressuring people we need different people to make different decisions. So that means also that we need different decision makers. And this is another reason why things like voting rights is a climate issue, right? In the US, we have this terrible voter suppression, right? That is a climate issue. And so what we really need to do is we need to really understand, and I think internalize, that elected officials are workers and they work for us. And they have for too long worked on the side of capital, and it's time to switch so that they actually make decisions that is really, again, it sounds like hyperbole, but it is really about the future of humanity. I mean, it is not hyperbole, right? It is not an exaggeration that entire nations will disappear. So now, I think we need to start understanding, and I think the other thing is really just to emphasize again, it's not just building, but we have to wield power. We are not in a polite discussion time anymore. I think disruptive actions, right? I think we need to be in the streets. We need to be disrupting life, because life will be disrupted if we don't have any actions.
Okay. All right. So Liliana, this one's for you. So could you comment on the Colombian Supreme Court recognizing the Amazon as a rights-holding entity? What is its impacts in terms of the issues which this panel is dealing with? What does it mean to actually recognize the Amazon as a rights-holding entity? Is this a helpful model to address discriminatory impacts of climate change? What does it mean to give personhood to the Amazon? And you're muted, but it...
I loved this question. Thank you. Well, I think that is a really important approach, because this right holding the Amazon as a right holding entire is a really important approach that changed the framework that in which we have built our legal systems, which also are centered in the humans, but these kind of decisions have this approach that makes you think on other subjects and other interests, which is really, really, really interesting. And I also think that climate litigation is a very important key to address climate change crisis, because governments don't want to do what they need to do. So we need them, and we need to force them to do what they have to. And the way, and one way is, of course, through climate litigation. So, of course, any idea of addressing these claims through the law and through legal systems, nationals, from the national and international level, I think that is a really, really important opportunity to continue fighting. And another issue about the case law is that has been really, really many difficulties in the accomplishment. So it's a really key issue to take an account. And I think that one of the problems, and it has to be, and it's really important to take an account this kind of problems when you are thinking about climate litigation, is that probably the construction of the action didn't take an account communities living in the Amazon. It was partly because it was filed in Bogota, which is the capital, from organizations in Bogota, and probably we would have more benefits for communities and more constructive processes if we, of course, involve the people who live there and who know the context and who know how the policies are gonna be implemented in the ground, because it's really important to have this approach. So it's a really complex and multi-diverse question answer, but I totally agree with the perspective of the decision. I think that we do need to continue using the law to demand responsibilities and human rights and climate obligations to the states, and also we have to take care and file and file these kind of actions and claims with the people who will be involved and who are gonna and will have the impacts of the decisions.
Right. I totally hear you. I totally hear you. I mean, yeah, it opens up a whole lot of questions actually about where do we go with this and how do we use this kind of in different places. So, okay, so here's the moment. So questions that you might have for one another. I just want to open up that space because I think it's important because you all are the experts and you've been listening to one another. Are there questions or things where you'd like to go a little bit deeper in terms of what some of your fellow panelists have said?
Maybe I have one for, let me just, sorry, I'm jumping across my screens here. Mijin, is it? So, you know, there's a lot of developments within, you know, kind of pushes from the women's movement, the women-led movement, but also feminist movements across the US right now, and necessary and really, you know, wonderful to see it. But I wondered how you're feeling about that kind of nexus between, you know, the pushback against sexual and reproductive health and rights in the US, you know, not just in terms of, you know, rights to abortion, but across the board, you know, kind of pushbacks from the right, extreme right. And then also when you've got this the feminist and Green New Deal that's being discussed. Are you seeing the linkages between those movements? I think there are, from what I can see externally, but I just wondered if you could comment on that, because I think that's a very interesting set of events, that are going on from the very kind of granular individual through to the system. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that there are linkages. I think that, we're just having an unprecedented attack on the sexual and reproductive rights of women. And I think, I do think that there is a segment of population that is maybe more privileged, that is just kind of in shock, that never really thought it would happen. And I think that there is a segment of women, largely women of color, indigenous women, who have always been under attack, so are very familiar, it's unfortunate and familiar territory. I think the linkages, I really think that when we censor the most vulnerable populations, so when we censor women of color, indigenous communities, I think you then get things like the Green New Deal, right, which is a transformative vision that would actually, make a more just society. So I think, what the reproductive rights, it has largely become divorced from other social justice issues, right? And it's really, I think, seen largely as a woman's issue, when we actually know that it is just a social justice issue, and it affects men as much as it affects women. And so I think that there is, I think people in the US struggle with how to respond to it. I think that there is still a hesitancy to say that, abortion is, there's still this idea that abortion is healthcare rather than something that a woman should do, regardless of whether or not, there could be absolutely no reason why she shouldn't have a baby. She should still, it is her body, right? I think that we've really butt against this kind of Christian Protestant ethic that is still very pervasive in a lot of American society and culture. So I guess what I would say is that I think that I would like to see more of this led by women of color, indigenous women. And I think that then you would have a more transformative vision that would kind of broaden out from, just seeing it as an abortion issue. It is really much more than just abortion and abortion access.
Thanks. Mijin, do you have questions?
I do. I actually have a question for Liliana, because I'm very curious about the coal transition in Colombia. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about kind of, where you see it going and what actors are involved. And I understand also that there is quite a lot of violence against environmental defenders in Colombia. So thinking about the human rights violations just from coming from defending the environment, and if you could just talk a little bit more about what's happening there.
Do you mean now the Amazon litigation case that we were talking about previously?
No, I had heard that I think Colombia has the highest number of murders of environmental defenders. Yeah.
It's a really complicated situation, because we were facing more than 50 years civil war, armed conflict, and the peace agreements just came like 4 years ago, but the territories are still in war. Because there are many interests in economies issues there. So it's so complicated to analyze Colombia as a whole territory, because there are many Colombians in Colombia, and what happens in the south is not the same that happens in the north, and there are so many actors and so many movements also, and so many issues around. But I really want to mention that definitely one thing that has exacerbated the violence against people and human rights defenders and environmental defenders is the lack of environmental democracy. I mean, we haven't learned how to deal with our problems and how to create spaces of democracy and participation. And that's why there are so many environmental conflicts, and also there are so many problems with human rights defenders under risk. So it's really key to promote this kind of exchanges about learning experience, about how communities and indigenous people, local communities, has faced the war for so many years, and their initiative to change their lives and to promote kind of different lives and ways of life. And it's really important that in this transition, in this energy transition, these communities come because the government plans don't make them don't let the people participate, and is of course is gonna exacerbate the violence and the exclusion and the problems that we are dealing right now.
Thanks. Thanks. So did you have a question for Noelene? Because I have a question for Noelene. So do you have a question for Noelene?
I do.
Okay,
Oh,
I cede the floor to you. Go ahead.
Care economy.
Yes.
I think that is a really important issue, and we have when we talk about climate justice, we talk about care economy, but how do we deal with it? I mean, how do we address it? How do we make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, the very quick answer I would give to that is we're pushing right now, and we're, the first thing to say is it takes such a long time even just to kind of get it into the discussion. So, now we're starting to finally see some discussion of it on the sidelines, but it's not yet a front of development discussion. And so I think that's our first challenge. And we have Oxfam in the Pacific and many others, Diva and many others who are trying to do that. So doing the sets of work, we've done some rapid care analysis studies, 4 of them at rural level, because we're trying to build the evidence base as well, for what can we say specifically are the situations, say, here in Fiji, but then how do you do that across the region? How do you get it on? The next set of work is how do you get it onto the regional platform, for a set of work? And that set of work is being done by the gender coordination mechanism. We have a set of groups that are both civil society, but also development actors and UN agencies. And so slowly that's starting to move through those spaces, the presentations and all of that. And then after that, we also have to do some work around the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting, because until we get it onto the formal agendas, we're just not really going to see it as as a top of health, kind of set of work, just like comprehensive sexuality education. That's another set of work like this that people kind of go, oh, that's a feminist set of work on the side and it's too radical. But one of the interesting things that I've been finding because of the COVID, this situation that we've all been in has shown us front and center, where is the care provision, whether it's paid or unpaid? What are the, 70% of our workers are women. And then you have the enormous sets of work that are being done right now to just keep our communities afloat. When you have over 200,000 people who are underemployed or out of work, out of a population of under 1 million, so you start to kind of not be able as a state to say this is not a central issue. You start to realize it's a central issue. And then I would say I'm also looking, and many of us are looking for examples where it has been able to at least get into the States. So Uruguay, I know, has some work on this. There's a couple of other countries around the world. And I think there is a body of work now that we have to put forward on. That's why I said about domestic policy, reconfiguration of the state, not just about what they're doing in aid and trade and all those bad stuff, but also that we're looking at it from a state perspective and domestic policy. Thanks. I hope that's just enough for a small one. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Awesome. All right. So look, folks, we're running out of time. All right. So, which is terrible because I feel like we're just starting to kind of get into it. But all right. So I wanted to give you each a minute. And I'm not even sure, but even like less than that, like really just kind of like last thoughts. And I would ask you, if you would think about the focus of this session, which is on human rights, which is on discrimination, which is on like what's a point you want to just make sure we capture? Somebody.
We don't get past discrimination to justice unless we are willing to do all these wonderful things that feminists have done for so long, and that I think are now starting to be recognized as beautiful tools and techniques. We have to do the intersectionality and the interlinkage analysis and the socioeconomic and ecological linkages. And if we do that, then we have a chance to turn this around, and we really need to take that now and join. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Liliana?
We have no choice. We need to change the way that we have been building this world, and I think that climate justice with these kind of discussions is a really important and a key need that we need to continue construction, build. If you want to save this life, the possibility of living for us in this planet.
Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely. Mijin.
Well, first I want to say thank you to Sofia, and thank you so much to Noelene and Liliana. I just learned so much from both of you. I just feel really grateful to have been a part of this. And I would just add that, we are very good at naming the problem, but I also think that things can change. Things have changed. Things do change. We can do this. And as Liliana mentioned, we don't have a choice, right? We have to fight. So that's what we will do. We'll fight.
Thank you for that. And can I just say, thank you all. You're all amazing, okay? You're all amazing and doing amazing work. I just, one of the things that really strikes me is that there's this flurry of activity that's happening right now across like all sectors, and partly, if not majorly, driven by COP26, but it's really up to all of us that we have to make sure that the pressure doesn't stop once the COP is passed. And for folks like you all, I think that's clearly not a concern. But for the rest of us who did not start in climate needs to stay at the center of all of our concerns, even if it didn't used to be, right? And I think we really need to all take that from this session and really make sure that we're bringing climate, we're bringing rights, we're bringing gender into these conversations kind of at all times. And, anyway, I just think this conversation has been fabulous, and I think you're all amazing. I need to now do my role, and I need to now alert everybody to the next two sessions, because they really are about moving us forward and building community. So we have a little break. Our next sessions will be Monday afternoon US time and Tuesday morning Australia time. And I want to say just a quick word about both sessions. The first is really trying to give us the opportunity to mix and to connect with other conference participants so that we can build alliances like we've been doing actually today in terms of research and activism. And for folks that are on here, this is really your session, so to speak. We're trying to create space for connections and for movement building. So please do sign up for that session so we can organize it properly, because we're trying to figure out how to do this kind of behind the scenes. And then next, kind of building on what we've discussed today, is the impact of climate change related disasters, fires, floods, droughts, on the ability of people to realize their right to health in these contexts. Now, the focus of the session is primarily on Australia as a case examples, but the issues clearly transcend and they're relevant to all of us. Justine is going to be chairing. We hope to see everybody there. And with that, let me thank the speakers for an amazing session, you, the audience, for joining us, and on behalf of all the co-organizers, I wish everybody all the best for the coming days. Thank you very much.